Are you good?
Yep, we're ready to go.
Awesome. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today are the types and range of documents that you should be preparing for an academic job search. Um, a few, a few, a few of the documents that we're talking about today. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about cover letters, and then CVs, and then we're going to sort of breeze through the idea of a teaching portfolio and what is a phrase which is still in use, some version of evidence of teaching effectiveness, talk about what that means. And then I'll spend a few minutes talking about the different kinds of statements, from teaching philosophies to research agendas and diversity statements that you might get asked for. A couple disclaimers. So first of all, the examples I'll point to come from my own discipline, which is rhetoric and writing studies. But I'm going to try and speak in generalizable terms that can apply to most academic fields. But you should, if you haven't already, start asking colleagues, instructors, people in your field for examples of these kinds of texts, because especially examples from people that have been successful in whatever it is you're trying to do, because those are going to be the most useful models for you. The second thing is I'm going to be moving really fast. And so you can send me an email at any point if you want, if you have specific questions. But let's just dive in and talk about, first of all, cover letters. The first thing to know about an academic cover letter is it's a fairly fixed genre. And what I mean by that is that you need to know the moves of this genre, especially which ones are flexible and which ones are not. And this is, I think, a really good example of sometimes you hear the phrase, let's say, hidden curriculum, or the idea of tacit knowledge. This is one of those things that if you don't write within the genre conventions of these documents, especially the cover letter, that can sometimes have a negative effect, or can very often have a negative effect, because it might lead the readers of these documents to question your sort of quote unquote fit for a particular job. The second thing you need to know about cover letters is that your target audience should be non-specialist. And by non-specialist, I don't mean the general public, but I mean someone who is familiar with your field or discipline, but not necessarily a specialist in the specific research or teaching that you do. Another way of thinking about this is write for a big tent audience within your discipline. So in my field, rhetoric and writing studies, this is still pretty much, a lot of these departments are still, or a lot of these programs are still in English departments. And so if I'm advising a PhD student who's applying for a job in writing studies, I'll say, you want to write a cover letter that, someone from literature or linguistics or creative writing could read and conceivably understand without too much difficulty. So what are some of these moves that you need to know? And I have a little asterisk there just to remind you, again, like, go out and seek out examples from your own discipline to compare and contrast with what I talk about here. But a few of the standard moves, especially if you're finishing your dissertation and this is going to be one of your first sort of big academic job searches. So the first thing is that you basically have 2 single-spaced pages, and that includes any head matter, letterhead, that kind of thing. Use as much of it as you can, but try not to go over. I still read, I was on a search committee this year. It's still common to get cover letters that are 3 pages long. I've even seen some that are 4. Longer cover letters are certainly appropriate for advanced positions or senior positions, but really sort of 2 single-space pages is a pretty fixed standard. So you want to stick to that. You also want to use a standard font, 11 to 12 size. And of course, I think you're welcome to play with margins, but you don't want to overdo it. It's one of those things that, I always tell folks, if it looks like you've been trying to cram as much space as possible or trying to make as much space as possible, you don't want it to look that way, right? You want it to look, you want your document, your cover letter to be an effective document. You want it to look sharp. You don't want the margins to be, just millimeters from the edge of the document. So just keep that in mind. You also want to design your cover letter for the type of position for which you are applying. And so I've listed a few of the most common ones. Of course, there are tenure track positions, there's admin positions, there are things like postdocs or full-time non-tenure track faculty. Essentially, when thinking about, well, what does this mean to design the cover letter for the type of position? What I'm saying is you want the primary task, you want to be thinking about what are the primary tasks that you're going to be asked to do in such a position, and then order them from most to least important and use that as an outline for your letter. And so as an example, I have like a kind of a fake job description here. Magnolia College, tenure track position, you teach 4-4, you advise undergrads, be active in the department, having an active research agenda is a plus. So let's just imagine, like, this is a hypothetical small liberal arts college or a SLAC, it's in the South, let's say. That 4-4, that's a typical sort of full teaching load, which means you don't really have a lot of extra time to do other things. It's clear that you're going to be asked to advise students, probably sit on department committees, department and college committees. It says active research agenda plus, so research isn't a top priority, but certainly encouraged. All right, so here's what an outline for a cover letter might look like for this particular job. Begin with an introduction, and then immediately sort of devote the sort of initial body of your letter to a summary of your teaching experience, because that's clearly the most important aspect of this particular job. Then you might have a short section where you're describing your scholarly experience. Then then you can talk about your service experience, and then you have a closing. And I'm going to go through in a few minutes and talk about what you can do within these paragraphs and sections. But you could also switch it around. You could switch the scholarship and the service around, for example. I don't want to put too much stock in the importance of organizing sections of a letter like this, but it does make a difference, especially when you think about how you might be using sequiturs to transition from one section to the next. But you do have some leeway, and this is a great example of sort of where you have flexibility within this fairly kind of strict genre or fixed genre of a cover letter. But let's take another example. So let's say there's a school out there called Wisconsin State University. There's not, but maybe there's a job, it's a tenure track position, teaching load is 3-2. You teach undergrad and grad courses. You got to have an active research agenda. So sorry for the typo here, but let's imagine it's an R2 university. It has a slightly lighter teaching load, but obviously research and publishing is required. And then like most other tenure track jobs, you'll probably be expected to advise students, sit on committees. Well, here's what a potential outline for that letter might be. It's very similar to the previous one, except you're devoting sort of the first 2 or 3 paragraphs to a summary of your research and publishing experience. Let me just dive into going over what some of these sections are, because again, like, this is where you need to know the moves that are expected in an academic cover letter. So introductions to these letters are really standard. And all of them almost always have a combination of these three things. So sort of you name the position you're applying for, you offer a quick summary of the current position that you have or whatever activity you're currently involved in, and then you have sort of this little elevator pitch in that order. So for example, here's a sample opening. I'm writing to apply for the assistant professor and professional writing position. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the communication, rhetoric, and digital media program at North Carolina State University. I've completed my data collection in 2 chapters of my dissertation. I'm on track to graduate in May 2017. I believe I am a good fit for this position because I have research, teaching, and practitioner experience in digital media as it pertains to professional writing. So I want to point out this one line that I've highlighted or change the color font to white. I have completed my data collection, 2 chapters. So you want to lead with info that will help the search committees see that you are qualified for the position. And especially if you're finishing a PhD program, this might mean specifying that you have the basic credentials. I don't need to tell anyone right now that academic job searches are really competitive. Usually committees get a lot more applications than they can honestly really sort of review thoroughly. So if there are kind of easy ways to start weeding out applicants, don't be surprised if search committees do it. And so if, for example, it's expected that you have a PhD in hand by the start of a certain date, well, if you haven't actually finished your dissertation yet, having a sentence up in your introductory, in that sort of initial opening paragraph of a cover letter that sort of describes the current state of your project is always smart, because it just emphasizes that, again, like in this case, you're on track to finish. This second sentence here, this is an example of sort of what that elevator pitch sentence can be. I sort of have a note here. I think this statement is a little bit too general to be effective, but it gives you an idea. Another version of this, which I just rewrote, is given my research on the communicative barriers medical professionals face when confronting vaccine hesitancy, along with my experience teaching, which includes an undergraduate technical editing course, I am well positioned to be a valuable addition to WSU's professional writing faculty. Again, like this is just an example. I just made that up, right? But and that might be a little bit too descriptive, but you can see how you might be able to kind of strike a median or a medium sort of sentence here that describes sort of, again, the things that you're doing, but also why you think you might be a good fit. So I have a couple actual real examples from letters. This is one. You can see these moves. The writer is naming the position. You see a current statement of where this applicant is. And then you have this little pitch. My strong record of teaching a variety of undergraduate courses at both public and private universities, along with my scholarship in rhetoric and writing, suggests I will contribute significantly as a colleague and teacher, right? In this department at Bradley. Another example, again, this is, very similar, state the position, state what this person is currently doing, and then you can see, again, there's a pitch of some kind. I just want to point this one out because, again, you can see this elevator sort of pitch transition sentence is a good example of how you can play with the genre expectations while still sticking to the script. So again, you don't want to try and reinvent the wheel with your cover letter. You want your cover letter to look and sound like what search committees are going to be expected to see. So depending on how you decide to organize your letter, you'll probably have a section where you describe your teaching or experience of some kind. A few rules of thumb. You want it to sort of summarize your teaching philosophy as you go. and this is something I'll come back to a few times. One of the challenges of preparing documents for an academic job search is that you might be asked to talk about the same types of things across multiple documents. So, for example, you might be asked to write a teaching philosophy, but also, again, like in your cover letter, you're going to want to say a little bit about your teaching. And so you don't want to replicate your diction across these documents. It's certainly okay to try to adapt similar ideas, but you want to try and have different articulations for each of these categories that that you can kind of sort of cut and paste as needed. But again, like with a cover letter, summarize that teaching philosophy as you go. And a good way to do that is to so maybe begin with one of the things that you always try to do in your teaching, or one of your goals, or one of your values, and then transition into examples. And that sort of gets to my second rule of thumb. You want to use examples that are both general and specific. But even more so, if you can, try and use examples that evidence your fit for this particular institution. And so a good way to practice this would be to sort of, open up a document, and, maybe just one document, you're going to call it sort of your teaching, writing about your teaching or teaching section or whatever. And maybe just describe 3 or 4 different projects from across classes you've taught, or describe particular experience, and just ready to go. You can maybe, again, like switch in, switch out, depending you're applying for it. Just like with creative writing, you want to show more than telling us things, right? Example, and this is again, like, use examples. Don't tell us, for example, that you really value collaborative work in your teaching, right? Show us what that looks like. So here's some sample openings to teaching sections from letters. I won't read through these, but you can sort of see how all of these sample openings speak to this idea of maybe leading with some values or some goals. And then you can imagine how these writers sort of would naturally transition into the use of examples. So I'm just going to leave this up here for a second. This is one paragraph from a teaching section in a cover letter from a real letter. Again, I just want to point out, like, in the middle of this letter, you'll see there are clear examples of how this particular applicant enacts their pedagogy in the classroom. I also want to point out towards the end, this letter writer is doing something smart, and they're pivoting towards a discussion of how their teaching experience can be relevant for current courses that are offered at the University of Memphis. And so if you want to go back and look at this, I just have a quick sort of outline. I did a reverse outline that basically, with the paragraph you just saw, begins with an overarching statement of this writer's aims or goals. That's then qualified. So again, sort of beginning with a statement that most everyone kind of can understand and get behind, and then there's a qualification of these goals that then transitions into a detailed example. And then there's a statement of general ability or experience, which sort of naturally leads into direct comments about the value of this experience to the particular institution. In a similar way, when you're beginning to talk about your scholarship or your research, you want to begin you want to follow a similar structure, which is begin with sort of the values, the goals. Again, sort of how would you describe your scholarship or research in very generalizable terms. And then you transition to, you want to summarize your current projects, what you're working on. And generally speaking, current projects should mean whatever is sort of the biggest, most substantial thing you're working on right now. So for most everyone who's watching this or listening to this presentation, that's going to be your dissertation. So you want to be able to summarize this project. But you can and should talk about other things that you're doing, including gesturing to future or upcoming projects, especially if you're applying for a position where your research and scholarship is going to be really important for the search committee in terms of who they're going to interview and eventually hire. So here's again, this is a paragraph from a real example. You can see that this writer begins with a quick description of their dissertation project and then moves into a discussion of sort of the method, sort of what specifically they're doing in this project. Yeah, and again, I'm just gonna leave this here for a few seconds, but you can go back and read this. Again, we could go back and critique some of the language in this paragraph. But again, you want your discussions of your scholarship to be understandable to folks within sort of that idea of like the big tent field. You don't have to worry about a general audience, but you want someone who isn't sort of geeking out in whatever your particular dissertation project is to still be able to understand and follow what it is that you're doing. So just a few rules of thumb, again, when you're talking about your research in a cover letter. Remember to write for an audience of non-specialists. A good model for talking about research is to follow this, or is to follow this outline. Sort of begin with a primary argument, discuss methods, and then takeaways, or the so what. But you also want to make sure you discuss the current status of your research, especially if you're a novice scholar, especially if you're just graduating or something like that. And by that, I mean, towards the end, whether you have one paragraph, two paragraphs, three shorter paragraphs for your research, towards the end of that section, this is a great way to transition into the next section of your letter, but step back and say, okay, so are you currently revising your dissertation for submission as a book manuscript? Or are you currently working on an article based on your dissertation research that you're planning to send out? Do you already have something that's out? Have you been invited to write a book chapter that relates to this project in some kind? Are you currently, looking for collaborations or whatever? I mean, it's really important for you to have a sentence or two somewhere towards the end of that research, the discussion that tells readers, again, so what are you doing right now? Sort of, what's the professional trajectory of this work? And then the last sort of like the final sort of big section that most cover letters have is a section on service. And again, the rules of thumb, you want to show and describe the kind of departmental or institutional citizen that you aspire to be. You can describe specific service experiences you've had, especially ones relevant for the particular job that you're applying for. You should also mention service experiences that you are eager to accrue, including and potentially sort of pitching service roles that aren't mentioned in the ad. This is one of the ways that sometimes you'll get advice that you should personalize your cover letters for each job. And that might sound like a lot of work. And, I think it's important to know that applying for academic jobs is a lot of work regardless. But sometimes when you're trying to personalize letters, it's very clear that, that there might be a generic statement that says something like, I'm very eager to, further, get to know faculty at name of institution or something like that. And And it's not uncommon to read cover letters where someone has forgotten to change out the name of the institution. Again, none of that stuff is like a deal breaker, but this is one of those sections, like in a service section, when you can really evidence that you've thought hard about this position. And so to be able to reference, the search committees that I've been on here at the University of Memphis, I always notice when someone mentions, for example, that let's say Memphis is, sort of the medical hub of the Mid-South. And so they're interested in maybe building collaborations with area health providers or something like that. I mean, that's sort of an easy way to demonstrate the sort of larger kind of long-term value you might bring to a particular job. So again, I have a couple more examples of just what it might look like to talk about your service. And again, with these examples, I'm just pulling out single paragraphs, or in some instances, excerpts of paragraphs. So you can see how actual writers have managed this work. All right, so a few other things. What else to keep in mind when it comes to cover letters? So you can incorporate asides relevant for the job at hand in any of the sections. In fact, it's always a plus when you can evidence your engagement with the job ad or the opportunity. And this is what I was talking about just now. If for example, in research and institution, you realize that maybe there's someone who works in the department that is interested in an area of research that's similar to yours. When you're discussing your research, it's totally fine to sort of include a sentence or two that says, by the way, I'm excited about the potential of working alongside Professor so-and-so and the kinds of work that can be done on that, whatever, that's totally fine. And again, that's an effective way to demonstrate your sort of sincere interest in a position. I've already said this, you want to avoid replicating prose that might show up on your CV or your teaching philosophy or somewhere else. The other thing, and this is something that has really blossomed since I was last on the job market, digital tech now makes it possible to share materials without having to share them. And what I mean by that is, sometimes, so for example, when I applied to the current position that I have here, I had already had a job at another university. And so I had a little bit more experience than folks right out of grad school. And so when I was talking about some of my research, I was trying to, and I was thinking about, well, I don't want to just list everything that I published. I mean, that's listed on my CV, but I do want to sort of talk about, I had multiple projects underway. There's only so much space in a cover letter. Well, this day and age, you can have a personal website, for example, or you might have an academia.edu website where you can upload descriptions of current research projects, sample text, this and that. And in a cover letter, you can always include just like a one-liner that says, to learn about, to hear more about some of these projects, feel free to visit my website, and you might just, maybe that's listed on your CV or somewhere else. So keep in mind that there are ways that you can, again, as I put it here, sort of share materials or invite people to examine materials that within the sort of the genre conventions of these documents, you can't really describe or talk about in ways that you might want to. So just to sort of start to wrap up this discussion of cover letters, here's where you can and can't break with the genre of a cover letter. So for sure, you don't have to follow the model of using long paragraphs. If you would rather sort of talk about your teaching in 2 or 3 or 4 shorter paragraphs as opposed to longer ones, that's fine. Paragraph length, that's negotiable. you can absolutely cut to the chase and avoid cliches. I always appreciate it when letter writers are very aware that your readers are, or that their readers are reading a lot of these documents. You can also disclose personal details if they might help the committee make a decision. So, I've seen in cover letters someone mention, you have to be strategic, right? But like towards the end of a letter, maybe in your conclusion, is a great way to mention, for example, that like you might have some family in the Memphis area or somewhere. And so, like you're really excited about this opportunity, that's totally fine. If you have some sort of personal experience that isn't necessarily kind of conventionally academic, quote unquote, but it does inform your teaching or your service or something like that, definitely incorporate that kind of stuff. That is helpful. Things that you can't do or you shouldn't do. You don't want to present, you don't want to not present the conventional parts of an academic letter. So that sort of research, teaching, service. You want to try and incorporate all those things. Again, depending on the type of letter you're writing, you might emphasize one of these more than the other two, but you want to try and touch on all of these things. You also want to maintain a pretty professional tone. This might seem self-explanatory, but if I'm saying in this presentation, don't do something, it's not because I'm just making it up. It's because I've seen people do it. So, to be sarcastic, funny, you want to avoid that. You also don't want to talk about, incorporate any information that's not relevant for the job at hand. And just as an example here, this is an excerpt from a real letter. And this is an example of what is actually a really great letter, but it's not a good cover letter. And it's not a good cover letter because it's breaking so it's deliberately sort of what, I can't get into the mind of the writer, but it's obviously not following the sort of the sort of strict genre conventions of a cover letter. I'm not going to read this. I'll leave this up here. You can go back and look at it. The writing is very good here, but it's more narrative. It's very personal. And again, this is the kind of letter that is going to, despite the qualifications of the person writing it, despite all the reasons why this person might be a really good qualified hire, the fact that they're not following these disciplinary conventions might signal to a search committee that they're not familiar with that particular decorum. And if this writer isn't familiar with, again, that particular decorum of a cover letter and how fixed the genre is, well, then what else are they not familiar with? So it's kind of a slippery slope in that sense. So CVs are the other thing. Most everyone knows what this is. They've started writing them. You've probably even heard advice. You want to have multiple CVs. I think that's a great idea. A few things, design matters. I'm an English professor and I tell people all the time, what you learn in kindergarten is not true. We do judge books by their covers. I absolutely hate ugly CVs. And, a lot of people think the same thing, you want CVs, these are documents to be designed. But again, just like a cover letter, you want to stick within the genre conventions. You don't want to break them too much. Content matters. How and what you include conveys your tacit knowledge. Again, there's the idea of the tacit knowledge or the hidden curriculum of both professional and disciplinary decorums. And then accessibility matters. At this point in history, I think most folks need to have an online professional presence in some way. It doesn't have to be extensive, but you should have one. And I say that because, again, we are living in an age when, people are going to Google you regardless, and so, you don't necessarily have to have a personal website, but there are, maybe it's an academia.edu page, maybe it's a professional blog, but a lot of times, again, if you have a site, an online site, this is where you can supplement, as I was saying earlier, you can supplement all of your job search materials with additional materials, provide more information, but more importantly, you get to sort of control the professional narrative. And so I'm just throwing that out there as we start talking about CVs. So academic CVs almost always generally include sort of head matter, which we'll talk about in a second, description of education, scholarship or research, and then I put conferences and presentations in parentheses because sometimes people differentiate between the categories of, let's say, research and conferences. Sometimes people put them in the same section. There's usually some kind of teaching, service, professional affiliations. And then sometimes, again, depending on your field, where you are in your career, the kind of experiences you've had, that kind of thing, they might include everything from descriptions of awards and grants, research interests, industry experience, invited workshops, talks, professional development, skills, references. Few things, what not to include on your CV. Photos of anything, never ever. People submit CVs with photos at least once every job search I've been on. We've gotten one of them. Hobbies, extracurricular stuff, that just anything that's not relevant to your professional experience, you don't want on it. Clip art, any kind of decorative font. Again, we already talked about fonts here, so I just have a few CVs I've just taken screenshots of that just shows sort of the top half of the first page. You don't need to read these. I just want to show you what the design looks like. This is a very sort of, I call it sort of a very kind of traditional design, just a Times New Roman font. Here's one, some of you might know Dr. Lane, who works in the English department. This was her CV when she applied for the position here. She's a professional technical writer, so you can see, this is a slightly less conventional font compared to Times New Roman, but it's a sans serif font that is very common in technical writing. And this is a sharp looking CV just from the top of it. Here's another one. Again, here's someone who's incorporating some design elements. You can see the kind of the colored box with this applicant's name on it. Again, when I say that you sort of judge a CV by, a book by its cover, this is what I'm talking about. All of these examples, I think, are fine, but you want to be thinking about sort of what your CV looks like as a document as you're going along. So when you're talking about, for example, scholarship, listing scholarship on a CV, it's increasingly standard to use a general heading. So something like scholarship, as opposed to, let's say, research, where you might have specific sections. So things like journal articles or works in progress or public writing, creative works. As I said earlier, if you have conference presentations, but have not published anything, or you don't have anything out for review, you might forego a separate scholarship section altogether and just call it, just conference presentations. You don't want to include categories in your CV if you don't really have content to fill those categories with. Sometimes people will call this general section publications instead of scholarship. And the only reason I prefer the latter term is I think it offers a bit more expansive view of the different types of research that people do. Again, I'm just listing, you don't have to go through and read these. These are just, I just want you to see what these look like on the page when they're designed. I've just screenshot some sections of CVs, so you can see how this person has broken up scholarship into certain categories. Here's one with just a general publications category. Another one, you can see that this writer has the very bottom a section on texts that are in preparation. I think that's always smart to include sort of work in progress or in preparation, especially if you're new, if you're sort of just now finishing your degree. The trick there is you don't want to overdo it, right? I mean, I'm always more persuaded when someone is sort of, preparing or currently working on one or two things as opposed to four or five. Very quickly, I just want to point out that if you have co-authored things, whether it's conference presentations or publications, it's pretty often that people will, it's in a lot of fields, it's conventional to list the author names in the particular order that that those names show up in the publication itself. And again, and that's the case even if even if it's very clear that you're the authors, people still sometimes list that their name next to a publication. In the humanities, I don't think that's really important. I also think that if you've co-authored something, but you want to eschew, or you just don't really subscribe to the idea of like numbered authorship, if you want folks to think about your scholarship in ways that kind of put the work itself first, as opposed to co-author, or as opposed to sort of the order of who wrote what, you can just forego that convention. But again, this is one of those field specific things that it's always good to sort of talk to folks that are doing what you're doing, talk to your advisors, get a sense of what they say, but you don't have to follow that system of numbered authorship on your CV if you don't want to. Conference presentations, generally you want to list in descending order, starting with the most recent or forthcoming to the to sort of what to the ones that are farther into the past. You can, but you don't have to, organize these by sections, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. Also, generally speaking, moderating your panel isn't really considered a presentation unless you served as a responder. I see a lot of folks listing these under conference presentations. They were just a moderator. That's something that you can list under service. So again, this is just a very kind of traditional way of just listing conference presentation. You can see how they starts in 2016 and goes down from there. Here's an example of an applicant or a CV where the writer has organized presentations by sort of sub-discipline. This is not very common, but it's certainly an option. And I'm showing you this just because this is another example of a place where you have some flexibility in what is otherwise a pretty standard genre. Here's an example of something that I just want to point out. So I put an arrow up here where this particular writer listed panel with Casey Boyle, Jody Nakatra, and Nathaniel Rivers here. This is not very common when you're writing a conference presentation on a CV, but this person included the names of their panel participants. And the reason they did that is, now again, if you're not in this particular field of study, there's no reason why you would know it, but all of these individuals are well-known scholars in the field. And this particular person had just finished their PhD and was applying for jobs. And so this was a strategic choice by this person to include the names of these scholars as co-participants on this panel. Because again, they want to sort of understandably kind of be associated with this group of scholars. The second arrow down here I've pointed to, you can see how this writer has obviously, or this scholar has obviously was working on and developing a project that went through several different iterations. And so they've been deliberate about altering the name of the presentation, even though if you ask me, I would assume that these presentations were pretty similar, because it's obviously the same project that's being developed at this point. But again, but these are things just to think about when you're listing scholarship presentations, that kind of thing on your CV. So teaching, generally speaking, you want to organize these by schools and not by courses, by which I mean, if you've only taught at one institution, well, just list that institution and then the courses that you've taught underneath there. As opposed to sort of if you've, let's say, taught first year writing at 4 different institutions, maybe you don't list like first year writing and then the names of institutions, right? Organize by institution first. You can especially put instructor of record next to courses if you think it's necessary to specify this, although a lot of times it's implied. But again, depending on your field, being a teaching assistant in some fields means you are actually a teaching assistant. You're not the instructor of record. Whereas in other fields, you're labeled a teaching assistant, but you are the instructor of record. So just keep in mind and consider whether or not your audience will know the distinction. Generally speaking, you really shouldn't include blurbs for gen ed courses on a CV if you're listing courses that you've taught. If you have a lot of teaching experience, I wouldn't include any teaching blurbs. If you don't have a lot of experience, you can include them. But again, like if you do, especially if you include descriptions for otherwise standard kind of survey or introductory courses, some people might think you're trying to sort of fluff up your CV. I just mentioned first year writing courses. There are no 2 first year writing courses that are the same anywhere, even within the same institution. On the other hand, those classes are pretty universal. It's a universal requirement. And so even if the details of the courses are different, their aims are pretty similar. And so again, you don't really need to explain to folks what freshman composition is. Again, you're writing for a Big Ten audience here, so you can assume that. So again, here are just some examples of that I've just cut and pasted of what teaching section might look like on a CV. I gave you this example just because there are a couple of things that this writer does that I think is kind of useful, but by no means it's something that you should do. Is notice the box here on the left. They've indicated how sort of what the course numbers mean, practically speaking, sort of, so 6,000 courses are primarily designed for Master of Science students, 7,000 PhD, that kind of thing. And then the second arrow on the right here is, so I'm reading this CV and I can see English 30-40. So I can see that it's sophomore, juniors, seniors, perspectives on writing and rhetoric. But then I see underneath it these bullet points. And what I automatically know from this is that perspectives on writing and rhetoric is a shell class. It means that there's no sort of set curriculum, that the instructor has the chance to sort of theme it or design it in a particular way. And so those bullet points represent 3 different iterations of that same course. So that's one way to account for whether, maybe you have some teaching experience, maybe, you've taught a course that gives you a lot of leeway to sort of theme or design a particular focus for that course. This is how you might represent those on your CV. When you're talking about service, you definitely want to organize by institution. If you have different categories of service, maybe professional versus institutional, you want to create different subsections. If you have some sort of substantial administrative experience, maybe you've had some internship experience within a program of study or something like that, you might want to create a separate admin section to your CV. But you can see here's an example on a general category of service. Then there's the category of professional service. So this is work that this person has done relative to some professional organizations. And there's institutional service. Same thing here. All right. We're kind of getting towards the end here of talking about CVs and grants, or just CVs, awards and grants. They can be, but they don't have to be separated into two categories. It really just depends on the amount of content you have, as well as your specific field. Generally, you list these chronologically, um, but otherwise, you have some options. You can list them closer to the beginning of a CV, or maybe um, maybe right before your scholarship or something like that. But you have options there. If you have any non-academic experience that's relevant, it should show up on your CV in some way, especially if it might reflect or inform on your current research or teaching. Sometimes this is labeled industry experience or non-academic experience. With that said, you don't want to list part-time jobs unless it might inform the kind of work that you're doing. So I have an example here. Let's say you were applying for a position that includes a service component. You might be like an assistant director of a writing center. And let's say, during part of your time in grad school, you also had some management experience, let's say at a Walgreens. Well, you might find a way to kind of incorporate some of that on your CV, or better yet, even sort of mention this in a cover letter. It's definitely possible. But if you just had a part-time job or something that you're just doing that just for the income or whatever, it's not really relevant. I wouldn't list it on your CV. Again, just here's what some of that might look like. Here's an example where the writer includes just some brief, a couple sentences describing what they did. Again, that's always helpful, especially if it's not clear how that experience might translate to your current work that you're doing. The idea of skills, I think, is one of those sections, again, but depending on the job you're applying for, the experiences you have, you might have a section where you include some skills. On an academic CV, I say that you should only list actual skills. And so what I mean by that is, like, let's say you can code in HTML. That is absolutely a skill. Teamwork, however, is not a skill. All right. We can, of course, when you're talking to, let's say, to undergraduates who are working on their first resume, they might want to put some of these sort of vague qualities on there. But, good communicator, team worker, these kind of things are not skills. And so I wouldn't list them here because they're too hard to qualify. But you really only want to list things that are directly related to your research or teaching. If you're competent with, let's say, the Adobe Creative Suite, for example, that is absolutely a skill. And again, depending on the job you're applying for, that might be really important. If you speak another language, or you're multilingual, or you have reading knowledge of a language, that's definitely a skill. These usually come towards the end of your CV. Here's a great example. This isn't labeled skills, it's just labeled software proficiency, which, again, like, is more or less conveys what this person can do. Notice they list Microsoft Office Suite here, and Google Docs. Microsoft is still sort of way more popular than Google. If, for example, the only software proficiency you have is with, let's say, Microsoft Office Suite, do not create a separate section and you list that. If you are watching this presentation right now, I guarantee you that you know how to use Microsoft. I am sure of it. So again, you don't want anything that you include on your CV to come across as sort of filler or something like that. Again, here's just another example of someone who just combined languages and skills. And what they're listing are, so Spanish, conversational and reading knowledge. Notice how they create categories. So there's proficient, working knowledge, that kind of thing. That's always helpful. A few things, a few final things. We're talking about CVs. Um, I think it's okay to list your coursework, but only list the courses that are directly related to your area of research or teaching. Most people don't include a coursework section on their CVs, especially as they gain more experience. But it can be useful if you just graduated, for example, and maybe transcripts don't list, let's say, the particular focus of a course. I was talking earlier about sort of shell courses, that kind of thing. Um, so again, like this is just from a sample CV. You can tell this person is listing the names of the instructors. So anyway, all right, I'm going to breeze through this last section here, talking about teaching portfolios and statements. So teaching portfolios usually can include any of the following. It can include your teaching philosophy, maybe 2 or 3 sample syllabuses, sample assignment prompts, student evaluations, seats, letters from supervisors, students. Any of this can go into a teaching portfolio. More often than not, if you're asked for a teaching portfolio, usually the job application will specify what to include. And so you want to follow whatever directions you're given. Sometimes you can include things called spec syllabuses. That's not really a technical term, but essentially, like, let's say a job that you're applying for, you might be expected to teach a course that you haven't actually taught yet. Well, it's totally okay to design a syllabus for that course. And it's sort of, by the idea of a spec syllabus, it's a speculative syllabus. So you would leave off, all the institution specific details. So you would leave off stuff about, plagiarism policy or phone numbers for this office or whatever. And you just sort of list, the major goals of the course, the learning outcomes, on a syllabus. Instead of, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, for listen days, you might just list like week 1, here's what you're doing week 1, week 2, here's what you're doing week 3. That's totally fine. When you see the phrase evidence of teaching effectiveness, think of this as a standalone document that summarizes your documented effectiveness as an instructor. And so you might compile your seats into a series of tables or charts. You might curate selected qualitative comments from students. You can even draft summaries of any teaching awards or certifications or unique professional development experiences you've got. That's usually what this means when someone asks for when you ask for evidence of teaching effectiveness. You can think of this as maybe like a 1 or 2 page document that presents sort of a snapshot of what kind of teacher you are. Some of these other statements, let me see here. Actually, sorry, got that out of order. So statements, all the statements, and we're at the very end here. In general, you can find tons of examples of statements online. And this is both a good and bad thing. It's a good thing because, again, there are tons of examples that you can read, look at. You'll very quickly identify ones that are really effective compared to ones that are not. This is a bad thing, though, because you also really quickly realize that there's only so much you can do in these statements, and that even the best written of these statements still are pretty generic. So, these can be really frustrating to write if you approach them as sites where you're going to be really evaluated for, let's say, the creativity or the novelty of what you say here. These statements are not places to really be creative and novel in ways that maybe you might be in your scholarship or something like that. And what I mean is, you shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. I have here, I say here, those objective statements some people still put on resumes, right? Like at the top of a resume. And I tell undergraduates, when I'm teaching like the resume genre to undergraduates, I say, don't include an objective statement. Everyone knows what your objective statement is. or everyone knows what your objective is. It's to get a job. And then even if you want to put an objective statement, like how many words are available for you to describe your objective that other people haven't already used in ways that are better than the ways that you can use them, right? This is what I mean, right? Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Clarity should always be chosen over sort of academic language, that kind of thing. Also, with statements of any type, I think it's really good to organize them around clear topic sentences. And so, for example, if you're going to write a teaching philosophy, maybe identify, right, like what are your top 2 or 3 values as a teacher, and use those to organize your philosophy or something like that. So a few things to keep in mind, the kind of statements that you might come across. You might be asked for a research statement. I think that you can think about research statements as a document that includes sort of 3 parts or aspects to it. There's generally an overview where you offer a general description of your research interests, your training trajectory, that kind of thing. There should be a description of what you're currently working on. So you start with the biggest project you're currently working on and work down. Here's a great example of what I was talking about earlier, where maybe you have a cover letter where you're describing your dissertation, but you're also asked for a research statement. Well, in the research statement, this is where you can go into a bit more detail. This is also where you can describe sort of your plans for a project, what you plan to do with it once it's complete. Finally, you should also include sort of what's next, what's on tap for you, what's in prospectus. Research statements tend to be, around 1 to 2 pages max, single spaced. You might consider breaking it into an easily scannable sections. There's no standard formatting, but you just want to be clear and consistent. So a teaching philosophy, I include an asterisk here because I think like I think that teaching philosophies are the best example of an academic job document that like there's no such thing in my opinion of just like a groundbreaking teaching philosophy. It's all really generic, but think about these kind of statements as a chance for you to describe how you approach teaching, what you do or techniques, and then how you know that your teaching is successful, sort of a discussion of goals or assessments, that kind of thing. And so begin with organizing your values, or start with a description of your organizing values or the outcomes that you have as a teacher. Then discuss some of the ways you enact these values and promote these outcomes. Just like if you're talking about your teaching in your cover letter, you want to use examples. And then finally, how do you assess the learning and outcome, the learning in your classroom, the outcomes you set out to achieve? But you can also use the end of a teaching philosophy to describe your continued development as a teacher. Are there things that you're currently experimenting with? That kind of thing. That's totally fine. You might be asked to write a philosophy of administration. And this is like a teaching philosophy, usually, again, 1 to 2 pages in length. But really, it's just where you describe what kind of leader you are. You should discuss whatever matters for a particular administrative position. So, for example, WPAs, which stand for Writing Program Administrators. But let's say you're a writing center director. You might discuss instructor training, assessment methods, support and development for tutors, labor conditions, engagement with department, college, university stakeholders, that kind of thing. Increasingly, folks are being asked to write some version of a diversity statement. And typically these, like other ones, are 1 to 2 pages. And in it, you account for, it's a description of how you account for diversity and inclusion, usually in your teaching. It's similar to a philosophy of teaching in that the less abstract you can be, the better. You can reference policy documents, statistics, influential scholarship, or exemplars, models, that kind of thing. And again, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. In fact, I've started telling folks that with diversity statements here, this is one of those genres where I think some people try to be really well-intentioned, but they come across as being a bit patronizing, I think, and that's never really intended. But especially if you're someone who identifies within sort of a majority audience of some kind. So, for example, like I'm a white male, right? And so, you know, I'm not going to try and sound like I'm not going to try and sound like I am an expert at sort of diversity, inclusion, these kinds of things, or rather, I'm not going to try to position myself as someone who is best enabled to instruct others about this. And so, in this case, I think it can be smart and even strategic to reference professional organization statements and best practices in a statement like this. So, for example, I just saw that an organization that I'm a part of, the National Teachers of English, the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, just released this statement: educators' rights and responsibilities to engage in anti-racist teaching. So this is like if I were to write one of these statements today, I might go through this and I'm actually reference. I might say sort of I am inspired by this particular statement, and I try to enact and I could just use some of the language from this statement, right? So I don't know why I just exited out of that. So again, like with a diversity statement, but really all statements, again, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And it's good to sort of maybe, again, in this case, align yourself with existing statements, existing practices, existing scholars and educators who are doing things that you want to replicate. I think that's totally fine. The final statement I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to wrap things up here, is you might be asked for, if you're applying to a university or a college that's affiliated with a particular religion or faith, you might be asked to write a statement of faith. This is always a mixed bag, and there's no generic and there's no set genre. I'd say here, it should go without saying that you should not apply for a position in an institution that will require you to lie about your commitments. That's what I think. This is sort of a strange genre. So ask for guidance or examples if a search committee doesn't offer specific instructions. A lot of times they will, because they know that this is a genre that a lot of applicants might not have experience with. On the other hand, this can also be one of those kinds of genres that, again, just like tacit knowledge, it's a way for search committees to weed out folks. And so, if you're applying to a specific job that's, at a faith-based institution, if you're a member or if you're affiliated with that particular denomination or sect or whatever, you'll probably be able just to jump right in and start talking about your faith pretty easily. And that would be obvious. If not, this statement might feel a bit tortured, and a search committee would recognize that. So that is, a very quick summary of all of the documents that you should maybe start thinking about as you're preparing for a job search. Cover letters and CVs are absolutely the two most important ones that you should start thinking about. But these statements are also ones that you can start developing language for, even if you haven't constructed them into actual drafts, because you might be able to cut and paste across statements. So I will leave this there.